Hello, everyone. Welcome to Byju's. This is Sneha Sharma, and we are in the process of discussion of NEET 2019 paper biology section, right? So, in today's section, we are going to continue the discussion of the questions of biology session. So, without wasting any time, let us start our session. Let's have a look at this question. The concept of omnicellular acellular regarding cell division was proposed by which of the following scientists? Aristotle, Rudolf Virchow, Theodor Schwann, or Schleiden? Okay, so omnicellular acellular is basically a statement which means all the cells arise from pre existing cells. And this was given by Rudolf Virchow. Okay, and let me exactly take you from the background of it. That is the point at which it started, and that point was basically the cell theory, which was discovered by Schleiden and Schwann. All right, so starting with Schleiden first, he was basically a German botanist who examined a large number of plant cells and said that all the plants are composed of different kinds of cells which ultimately form tissues of the plants. All right, then going on to Schwann, he was basically a zoologist, but he kind of studied both plant cells as well as animal cells. And he reported that cells, especially animal cells, have a thin outer layer which is called as the plasma membrane. Because as you already know, that animal cells do not have a cell wall. All right. He also concluded that plants have a cell wall. So animal cells do not have a cell wall. Their outermost membrane is going to be the plasma membrane. And when you talk about the plant cell, outside or outer to the plasma membrane, plant cells have a cell wall. All right. So he hypothesized that the bodies of animals and plants are all composed of cells, right? And this is what led to the development of cell theory, like I said. Okay. So initially, when cell theory was proposed, it basically had pointers which was given by Schleiden and by Schwann, and ultimately it all said the point that all plants and animals are all composed of cells. All right. But here there was something amiss, which was given by Rudolf Virchow, right? He gave the statement that omnicellular acellular, and this statement exactly means that all the cells arise from pre-existing cell, and this theory was exactly called as theory of cell lineage. Okay, this is one point that you have to remember. Sometimes question is also asked based on who discovered or who proposed the theory of cell lineage, or who modernized the cell theory. In all the cases, your answer is going to be Rudolf Virchow. Okay, so now cell theory, which was given by Schleiden and Schwann, this combined the information that was proposed by Rudolf Virchow, which obviously stated that all the cells arise from pre-existing cell, and this whole thing came together to formulate the modern day cell theory. Okay, there are multiple points to it here, but we are listing down only two of the important points. That is, modern day cell theory states that all the organisms are composed of cells and the products of cells, and all cells arise from the pre-existing cell. So these two are the key important points of the modern day cell theory. All right. Talking about Aristotle, who was basically the father of biology, he was one of the first and the most earliest scientific contributor, or the basis, initial basis of classification, which happened on the morphology. When you look around things, when you look at the physical morphology or physical appearance of things and take them into consideration to understand or to classify things, that is the kind of attempt that Aristotle did. All right. So his classification was based on, first thing is simple morphological features and all these external characteristics. And this kind of classification is what is called as the artificial system of classification. So he had very, very basic form of classification where he studied that, organisms which have blood cells, which do not have blood cells, that is basically the red blood, and do not have a red blood kind of thing. So these were the kind of basic characteristics that Aristotle had used. And because he was one of the earliest contributors to biology, we call him as father of biology. Not relevant to this question, but because this is given as one of the options, that is the reason why I discussed the whole details about Aristotle. All right. So the right answer for the given question is option B, Rudolf Virchow. Let's have a look at this question now. Which of the following glucose transporters are insulin dependent? Now, this is slightly kind of a tough question. This is one of those questions which for which the difficulty level is quite high. Okay, but still, I will try to give you all the explanation that is required for this particular question. So, going ahead with it, which of the following glucose transporters are insulin dependent? Here you have four options, which mentions a range of GLUT 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, first thing is, what is exactly this GLUT? Okay, GLUT basically refers to the glucose transporter, which are membrane proteins or membrane transport proteins which are involved in transportation of glucose across the membrane. Okay, now having said that, it sounds very simple, but then these are all the transporters which are very, very specific in their action and the location at which they are functioning, also the conditions under which they are functioning. Okay, so to give you a quick background of things related to this particular question or the information related to this particular question, please understand this. Glucose transporters help in transport of glucose across the plasma membrane by the process of facilitated diffusion. Now, you all know what is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is a process of diffusion. That means the molecules are going to move from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, but with the help of another molecule or with the help of specific proteins. Okay, clear everyone? So this kind of facilitated diffusion does not require energy, but it does require special channels, and those special channels or proteins are what are referred to as GLUT, right? GLUT. Okay, now there are a wide variety of membrane proteins. When you talk about glucose transportation, there is class 1, 2, 3, but you all don't need to know the details of it, just understand the class 1 right now. So when you talk about class 1, it comprises of GLUT 1 to 4, the options that are given to you in the question. Okay, so let me give you a quick background of all these four types of glucose transport proteins. First is, when you talk about GLUT 1, this is one of the major glucose transporting proteins as such, but these are all widely distributed in fetal tissues. Very important point. Second thing, they are expressed in really high level in the erythrocytes, that is your red blood cells, and also in the endothelial cells of the barrier tissues such as blood brain barrier. So you know, endothelial lining is usually made up of, you know, squamous epithelium, especially when you talk about the lining of the blood vessels. Okay, so here the transportation of glucose is done with the help of GLUT1 protein, but this is insulin independent. That means what? This action or the functioning of GLUT1 transport protein is not going to be dependent upon insulin. It is an independent kind of transport protein. Okay, and our question had asked us which one of the following is insulin dependent one. Okay, going ahead to GLUT2. Now, when you talk about GLUT2, it is basically present in the basolateral membrane of the small intestine epithelium, and it is also expressed in renal tubular cells, liver cells, and pancreatic cell. So pancreas, liver, and your small intestine, that is when you talk about enterocytes, etc., that is where GLUT2 is functioning. Okay, but once again, here also GLUT2 is also an insulin independent kind of transport protein. Okay, clear everyone? So GLUT1 was involved in RBCs, in the blood brain barriers, in the fetal tissue. GLUT2 is there in the renal tissue. It's going to be there in the liver, predominantly in the liver, small intestine, and pancreatic cells, etc. But both of them are insulin independent till now. We go on to GLUT3 now. GLUT3 is expressed mostly in neurons and in the placenta, but this is also insulin independent. But when you talk about GLUT4, this is very important. This is expressed in a lot of adipose tissues and the muscle cells, right? Striated muscle cells, which are obviously the voluntary muscles we are talking about. This functions in a way which is insulin dependent, right? Clear everyone? Insulin dependent, and hence this is going to be the right answer. Now, I'm not going to end the question here. Let me explain you how exactly this GLUT4 comes or works, right? Because this has been asked in exam. So let us try the functioning. Let us understand the functioning of this particular GLUT4 transport protein. So what happens is, here you are seeing a cell. This is a very nicely given image. What you see here, this is a plasma membrane, right? I'm writing it down in short. You see here, this is the external environment of the cell where you see these glucose molecules are here, right? Here you are seeing across the plasma membrane an insulin receptor. This is an insulin receptor which will bind to insulin. Now what is happening here is, you see that here insulin receptor is not binding to any or is not attached to any insulin molecule, right? You know what is insulin, right? It's basically a hormone which is secreted by the pancreatic cells, the endocrine part of it, right? So here, because there is no insulin, that is why GLUT4 is not functioning here, and this GLUT4 is not allowing the glucose molecules, even though it is present here, it is not being allowed to enter inside the cell. So in the absence of insulin, glucose is not entering the cell here. Now what happens when the insulin is here? Insulin signals the cell to insert GLUT4 transporters into the membrane, allowing the glucose to enter the cell. Look at the image now. Okay, I'm going to change the color of the marker here so that it's better, its visibility is better. Now what you see is, look at the first stage. Insulin has come into picture. Insulin is now attached to the insulin receptor on the plasma membrane. Once again, this is the plasma membrane, and here is where you have your insulin receptor. All right. Now, as soon as insulin hormone binds to this receptor, it brings about a cascade of events. It brings about the activation and functioning of the GLUT4 protein. And these proteins are going to open up the channels and allow the glucose molecule which was present outside the cell to now enter inside, and hence bringing about intake or uptake of glucose by the cell. Once again, I'm going to repeat this whole point. Very important. What happens is, especially in case of GLUT4 transport proteins, is that when insulin binds to the insulin receptor, it brings about the activation and functioning of the GLUT4 proteins. This basically opens up the channel and allows the facilitated diffusion of glucose, and glucose here enters the cell, and hence bringing about the uptake of glucose in an insulin dependent way. Are you all clear with that? That is why for this question, the right answer, which was asking about which of the following glucose transporters are insulin dependent, the right answer here is going to be GLUT4. I hope with that you all have understood this question very well. So let's see this question now. Which of the following statements is correct? So this question basically revolves around cornea, and we have to choose the right answer with respect to cornea. So let us read out the options first. Cornea consists of dense matrix of collagen and is most sensitive portion of the eye. Actually, yes, this is the first statement and it's a correct statement. But we will still look at the other options to see what is right and what is wrong about them. The second statement is cornea is an external, transparent, and protective proteinaceous covering of the eyeball. So the external and the transparent covering is actually sclera and it is not cornea. So obviously statement B is going to be incorrect. Talking about the third one, cornea consists of dense connective tissue of elastin and can repair itself. No, like I said in statement 1, it's made up of the dense matrix of collagen and not elastin. So this is not correct. And then talking about the fourth statement, which says cornea is convex, transparent layer which is highly vascularized. So the highly vascularized portion is actually the choroid layer, right? Hence, obviously, statement D is also incorrect. So we have the right answer clearly, which is option A. Okay, so this question is basically based on eye. Coming from the chapter Neural Control and Coordination, let us try to have a quick background about the structure of the whole eyeball that we are talking about here. So we are here in this particular question, we are covering the concept of wall of the eyeball. So we know there are three major layers to it. There is sclera, there is choroid, and there is retina. Sclera being the most external layer, it is composed of dense connective tissue and the anterior portion of the sclera, what you are seeing here, right? So the anterior portion of the sclera is what is called as cornea, and it is a transparent layer. It's a very, 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 very important point. Okay, now going and talking about cornea a little bit more in detail, because that's what the question is based on. If you see it, it's actually a convex portion. You know what a convex portion looks like. This is like a biconvex, right? So when you see a curvature like this is what is called as the convex portion. So like you see in this image also, this basically has is transparent in nature and is consisting the dense matrix of collagen and corneal epithelium. So honestly speaking, if you try to put it in a more classified way, you can say it this way, that cornea basically has both the things. See, this is cornea. Okay, it has both the things. There is cellular portion to it, and then there is acellular portion to it. All right, cellular and then acellular. When you talk about the cellular portion, it basically contains the keratocytes. All right, it has all the epithelial cells, right? It also has the endothelial cells. So I'm writing that portion in short here. And when you talk about the acellular portion, it was also obviously has the collagen that we have already stated, and it also has something called as glucosaminoglycan. Okay, it's basically a carbohydrate. It's basically a polysaccharide. Glycans word refer to polysaccharides, right? So cornea has got both cellular portion as well as acellular portion. The cellular portion is referring to keratocytes. It has endothelial cells, it has epithelial cells, and then talking about acellular portion, it has collagen, it has glucosaminoglycan. All right, and this cornea is basically the most sensitive part of the eye, and hence needs to be really taken care of. Talking about the remaining options that were incorrect, so we had explanation about the most vascularized part of the eye, that is basically choroid, right? Like you see here. So it is the middle layer which contains a lot of blood vessels, and hence we call it as highly vascularized. And talking about the third layer, it's basically the retina, very important. It has 3 layers of neural cells, and hence are obviously responsible for the major part of the vision, especially when it comes to the neural control. There are ganglionic cells, there are bipolar cells, and then there are photoreceptor cells. Clear, everyone? There is sclera, choroid, and then retina. Okay, so the right answer for this question is going to be option A. Let's see this question now. Match the following genes of the lac operon with their respective products. So first thing, what is exactly an operon? Operon is basically that segment of DNA which has related genes. So there is usually going to be a promoter, there is going to be a regulator, there is going to be an operator, and then there is going to be certain structural genes. Lac operon is basically meant for utilization of lactose as a sugar present in prokaryotes. Okay, clear, everyone? So that is like the basic gist of the background for you. I'll obviously discuss lac operon just in a while. So here in column 1, you have been given the details about genes, and in column 2 you have been given about the functions or the products that these particular genes are going to form, and functions that they are going to play. All right, so before actually trying to do a match here, I want you all to actually recall the lac operon. Okay, so this lactose operon is basically an inducible operon, which means what? That lac operon is usually going to stay off. Okay, it's not going to be working in normal condition when glucose is available for the prokaryotic cell to take it up. Okay, but once the glucose is exhausted and the cell wants to utilize sugar for obvious reasons for the production of energy, then the cell utilizes the lactose by breaking it down, of course. So this lactose has to be utilized by certain set of specific enzymes which are basically coded by this lac operon. Hence I said, lac operon is nothing but lactose operon. So when you look at this particular operon, when the inducer, that is your lactose or beta galactose, is not there, right? So here what you have is, there is a promoter gene, there is gene I, which is the regulator gene. Then you have another promoter, of course. In a segment of DNA you can have multiple promoters. And then gene, obviously O basically is responsible for something called as operator. And then talking about these 3 genes, that is ZYA, these are all the structural genes. So let me write down the previous ones also. So I here is the regulator. Okay, there's lesser space here, that's okay. So P stands for promoter, like I said. All right, okay, cool. So what happens here is that when the inducer is not there, that is in the absence of the inducer, the regulator makes or transcribes its own, the gene is there, the transcription is going to happen. This leads to formation of a repressor mRNA. Okay, Repressor is does not mean this mRNA is going to repress something. We are just calling it as repressor because this mRNA is going to make the repressor molecule, okay, on obviously translation. So on transcription, right, this is the transcription arrow. This arrow is depicting that transcription is happening here, RNA synthesis is happening here. So on transcription, the regulator gene is going to make the repressor mRNA, which on translation, that is protein synthesis, is going to make the repressor molecule. This repressor goes and binds to the operator region and brings about stalling of the RNA polymerase here, and that is why the structural genes are not going to get transcribed, and hence the lactose would not be utilized further. Clear, everyone? Yes, you all got my point. Once again, when the operon is off, that is in the absence of the inducer, the regulator gene I is going to get transcribed. It will form the repressor mRNA, followed by formation of the repressor molecule here, which will go and bind to the operator region, stalling or preventing the movement of RNA polymerase further. Okay. Once this is prevented, obviously the structural genes which are lying, downstream of the operator are going to be not transcribed, and hence no enzymes would be synthesized for the lactose utilization. Clear, everyone? Now what happens in the next case, that is when the inducer is present. Okay, and why do we call it as inducer? Okay, so that is exactly what I'm going to cover here. Once again, just like normal case, the regulator gene I is going to make the repressor molecule, which repressor mRNA first, followed by synthesis of repressor. But because inducer is there, because lactose is there, what will happen? This inducer molecule, which actually technically speaking is called as allolactose, okay, this allolactose will go and bind to the repressor molecule, making it inactive, and hence this molecule can no longer go and bind to the operator region, and hence RNA polymerase can easily move downstream, bringing about the transcription of the respective structural gene. So here you have your 5 prime to 3 prime mRNA molecule. Transcription has happened very well, followed by translation. Okay. And what is happening in this translation? Gene Z, that is a structural gene, is responsible for coding for beta galactosidase, which is responsible for breaking down of lactose. Talking about permease, it basically allows the entry or makes the membrane more permeable towards for the entry of this particular sugar, that is coded by gene Y. And talking about gene A, which is also structural gene, it's responsible for coding for trans-acetylase. And all these three enzymes are extremely important for utilization of lactose. Clear, everyone? So now let us look at the question back, and now let's try to do the match. Okay, so gene I is synthesizing what? It is synthesizing the repressor. So gene I is matching with option 3, or the match column sequence 3. Talking about gene Z, Z is responsible for beta galactosidase. Talking about option C, that is A gene, ZYA it was. So A is responsible for trans-acetylase, and talking about Y, that is option D, it's responsible for the synthesis of permease enzyme. So now if you see, the right answer for this question is going to be option D. I hope with that you all got this question correct. Let's see this question. Respiratory quotient or RQ value of tripalmitin is. Okay. Now, normally what happens is that examiners usually don't ask anything outrightly out of the syllabus or something like that. They won't give you a very random molecule. Not that it can't come, but most probably this is how the scenario is, that usually the information comes from the textbook. Now this tripalmitin is a textual example. It is given in your textbook, and that is why this question has been asked, and it's not a tough question. It's a quite straightforward question. Okay, first thing, what is respiratory quotient? Respiratory quotient is basically a quotient. It's a ratio which gives the value called as RQ value, which basically represents the ratio of volume of CO2 released upon the volume of oxygen consumed for oxidation of something. Okay. oxygen consumed. Okay, so volume of CO2 released versus the volume of oxygen consumed. Clear, everyone? This is what is going to tell you the details about how oxidation or breakdown of a molecule is happening. Now, if you see carefully, let us say that you didn't really know the reaction or things like that, but if you see carefully, tripalmitin is a fatty acid. Clear? I'm just telling you a quick overview in which, had you not known the example also very well, just by knowing that it's a fatty acid, you could have still solved the question if you didn't remember the equation also. Okay, so tripalmitin is a fatty acid. Now, when you have learned about respiratory quotient, you have very clearly learned about the fact that usually the carbohydrates have an RQ value of usually equivalent to 1. Fatty acids have an RQ value of equivalent to 0.7. Okay, so with that, you could have easily attempted the answer as 0.7. Clear? But let me take you the longer route right now. The fact that you should have known any which way, okay, which is about the detail of the tripalmitin reaction that's given in your textbook. So first thing, respiratory quotient is the ratio of the volume of CO2 produced to the volume of oxygen consumed in respiration over a period of time. So this is how you give your RQ value. Now for tripalmitin, which is a fatty acid whose molecular formula is C51H98O6. So when this undergoes oxidation, what will happen? There are 145 let me read the equation the true way. So C51H98O6 combines with oxygen to give CO2, water, and ATP molecule. Now, how many moles of basically CO2 is going to be released, or volume when you talk about? You are going to use this number divided by this number, that is 145. And even if you do this kind of division, if you knew the reaction, the answer would have come up to 0.7. That is exactly what I'm trying to tell you, that even though we have given tripalmitin here in this question, just by knowing that it's a fatty acid, you could have given the answer without even knowing the reaction. But you should know the reaction because it is given in the textbook. Okay, so the right answer for this question is going to be option C, 0.7. The ciliated epithelial cells are required to move particles or mucus in a specific direction. In humans, these cells are mainly present in. Okay, it's a straightforward question. This is like a very clear question where you know that ciliated epithelial cells, that is those epithelial cells which have these projections called as cilia, these are required to move particles or mucus in a specific direction. So honestly speaking, they have actually given you the function of the epithelial cells also in this particular question itself. Okay, so in humans, all you need to do is identify where exactly these are present. Options are bronchioles and fallopian tubes, bile ducts and bronchioles, fallopian tubes and pancreatic duct, or eustachian tube and salivary duct. So here you know that the areas, or rather the hollow areas where something needs to be really continuously pushed, or it's very important for those cells or those mucus or that particulate matter to be pushed, are the areas of bronchioles and the fallopian tubes. Okay, let me remind you that these bronchioles have cilia given just like this, how you see in this particular image. Okay, now what is happening is you're seeing that there is a continuous motion of the cilia like this, and this kind of beating motion or movement is bringing about the movement of all these particles that you're seeing which are moving in this particular direction. So what happens this way is that when mucus is being pushed away or propelled in one direction, along with that all the particulate matter is also going to be propelled forward so that it can be obviously removed out of the body. Clear, everyone? This is exactly what it is, how it is functioning in bronchioles. And when you talk about the fallopian tubes, so here the mucosa has these epithelial cells which are columnar and which are ciliated. It's very important for these cells to basically have this particular cilia and have the projection or propulsion of the propulsion of that in that area. The reason is why, because the uterus lining uterus lining, and I'm continuing into the fallopian lining of course here, it has to propel forward the ovum or the egg. Clear, everyone? So when I say uterus, I was referring to the female reproductive tract, and it is obviously continuing into the wall of the fallopian tube, and that is where ovum really needs to be propelled for the purpose of fertilization, for that matter, right? Clear, everyone? So fallopian tube also has these projections which allow the propulsion of ovum with the help of cilia. So the right answer for this question is going to remain as option A. Let's see this question now. Which of the following statements regarding mitochondria is incorrect? So we are looking at incorrect statement regarding mitochondria. What is mitochondria? It's a double membrane structure which is present in the eukaryotic cells, and it is the powerhouse of the cell for the reason that it produces energy for the cell. Okay. Now, let us look at the options here. Let us read out the options. Mitochondrial matrix contains single circular DNA molecule and ribosomes. Yes, it does have a circular DNA and it does have ribosomes. Option B, outer membrane is permeable to monomers of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Yes, the outer membrane of the mitochondria is a smooth membrane and it is quite permeable for that matter, especially to smaller molecules like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, the monomers of these molecules. Okay, so this statement is also correct. So first was correct, second was correct. Looking at the third option now, enzymes of electron transport are embedded in outer membrane. No, they are embedded in the inner membrane, and that too in the folds, right? So the cristae or the folds of the inner mitochondrial membrane has basically the members of the electron transport chain. Okay, so not just the cristae for that matter, actually it is the whole inner membrane. But if you understand it, why cristae has happened or why cristae have formed, this is basically to increase the surface area of these particular particles which are responsible for ATP production. Okay, so this statement is incorrect, and that is exactly what the question is asking. So for this question, this becomes the right answer. Let us still go ahead with option D. Inner membrane is convoluted with infoldings. We are talking about convolutions, means foldings, etc., or infoldings or invaginations. So this statement is also correct. Clear, everyone? Yes, let us quickly revise about mitochondria. So when you look at mitochondria, it is basically responsible for the three major pathways like we talk about. There is, oxidative decarboxylation. It is not really a pathway. It's just like a reaction. Very small thing, but very important for aerobic respiration, for complete aerobic respiration. This basically is brought about in the mitochondrial matrix. Talking about Krebs cycle also occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. Krebs cycle basically is responsible for breakdown of your acetyl coenzyme A completely into carbon dioxide and water, right? And then talking about electron transport chain, which is also called as referred to as oxidative phosphorylation, because there is oxidation happening here and there is phosphorylation reaction happening here, because of which the ADP gets phosphorylated and formation of ATP takes place. So ATC is responsible for energy production, ATP production, and this happens in cristae or the inner mitochondrial folds. Clear, everyone? Talking about the rest of the points, that is describing the whole structure of the mitochondria. Matrix has 70s ribosomes, it has RNA molecules, it has DNA molecules also. Now here matrix, when you talk about, it is rich in enzymes and proteins that are involved in the respiration and some other metabolic pathways as well. So here is what you see, these ribosomes are there associated with a lot of RNAs also. Okay, then like I said, it has its own DNA. We call it as mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA. Yeah, this is how it is. It's circular in nature for that matter, which is where it kind of resembles the prokaryotic DNA a little bit. Clear, everyone? Then we go on to the outer membrane. Like I said, it's a smooth membrane. There are no folds here, so it is continuous, and it contains specific transport proteins which allows it to be selectively permeable. Clear, everyone? Okay, so this is selectively permeable. And then when you talk about the inner mitochondrial membrane, this is what is thrown into folds called as cristae, which increases the surface area because it is responsible for ATP synthesis. With the help of ATP synthase, we also call it as F0, F1 particle, Fernandez-Moran particle, oxysomes, or ATPase for that matter, which is ultimately responsible for ATP production. So what you see here, F0, F1 portions, these are knob-like structures like this. Okay, this is how exactly it is. There is a base, there is a stalk, and there is a head portion to it. Clear, everyone? So for this reason, our right answer for this question is going to be option C. Let's see this question now. The shorter and longer arms of a submetacentric chromosome are referred to as. Very straightforward question. Okay, when you look at the submetacentric chromosome, what does it mean? Submetacentric means the centromere position is slightly away from the median or slightly away from the center, like you see in this particular image. Let me change the color. Yeah, like you see in this particular image. So if it was center, a centromere would have been here, somewhere here in the middle. Because it is a submetacentric chromosome, the centromere is slightly away from the center, that is at a submedian position, and that is what is referred to as submetacentric chromosome. Okay, now next point is that this kind of location of centromere causes the chromosome to appear like it is having a shorter arm and a bigger arm. And the French word for small is basically petit. Okay, interesting it is. Yeah. So petit basically refers to small. And that is the reason why the smaller or the shorter arm of the chromosome is referred to as the P arm. And because the next alphabet that comes after P, for the very simple plain logic, it is called as Q arm, which is the longer or the bigger arm. Clear, everyone? Once again, the French word petit is what refers to the small, size, and that is exactly why for the chromosome, P arm refers to the smaller or the shorter arm, and the longer arm of the chromosome of a submetacentric chromosome is going to be referred to as the Q arm. So, like we have given here, P arm is going to be smaller than the Q arm. So, the right answer for this particular question is going to be option C. Let's see this question now. Purines found both in DNA and RNA are. Okay, so what are purines? First thing, they are basically the nitrogenous bases present in the nucleic acid, DNA, and RNA. Okay, in fact, for that matter, when I'm talking about the nitrogenous bases, let us talk about pyrimidines as well. So, as you know, when you talk about the nitrogenous bases which are present in the both DNA as well as RNA, they are of two types: purines, which are the structures having two ring structures, and the pyrimidines have a single ring structure. Purines are of two types for both DNA and RNA, that is adenine and guanine, which is exactly what the question was asking. Purines found both in DNA and RNA are. Okay, so answer is clear here. Option C, adenine and guanine. When you look at the pyrimidines, the three pyrimidines that exist in case of DNA and RNA, like talking collectively, is cytosine, thymine, and uracil. Thymine is exclusively present only in DNA. Cytosine is, of course, present in both. Thymine is present only in DNA, and uracil is present only in RNA. This is like, a very basic difference, a very important point of difference, which you need to know for both DNA and RNA. Clear, everyone? So when you look at the overall picture of DNA and RNA, this is how I'm sure you must have learned also, that DNA is usually a double stranded molecule and RNA is usually a single stranded molecule. It might have certain folds over itself, but usually RNA is a single stranded molecule. Let me just change the color of the marker here. Yeah. Okay. So DNA, RNA, DNA, like we've stated, it's going to be a double stranded structure. RNA is usually a single stranded structure, though it might have certain folds over itself like this. Okay. So you see there are these folds that are existing. This is happening within the same strand, but it's not double strand. Okay. Second point of difference is that, when you're talking about the sugars present in case of DNA is deoxyribose, and the sugar present in case of RNA is the ribose sugar. The major point of difference here lies at the second carbon. This is the second carbon where where the oxygen group is removed in case of deoxy. As the name is stating, deoxy, without oxygen at the second carbon. So instead of hydroxyl, in case of DNA, there is a presence of hydrogen atom there, whereas in case of RNA, at second position, there is presence of a hydroxyl group there. Clear, everyone? Now we go on further. We go on to the third point of difference, which is bases. Bases in case of DNA are going to be adenine, guanine, like we stated. These are the obviously the the purines. And when you talk about pyrimidines, it's going to be the thymine and the cytosine. So ATGC, or as it is given here, TCAG, doesn't matter. The sequence doesn't matter here right now. Okay. Then you talk about the bases that are present in case of RNA. It's going to be adenine and guanine. Yes, these are the purines. And when you talk about pyrimidines, cytosine was common with DNA and RNA, but instead of thymine, here there is presence of uracil. Clear, everyone? So the right answer for this question is going to be option C, adenine and guanine. Let's have a look at this question now. Which of these following methods is suitable for disposal of nuclear waste? Now, this is like a very important question, especially when you talk about from environmental point of view. Okay, now nuclear waste comes from where? It basically comes from all these research, labs. It comes from hospitals where there is, radioactive therapies that are used, especially for the treatment of cancer, etc. Then you also have radioactive waste from, all these nuclear power plants, etc. So treatment of this nuclear waste is very, very important before we actually bring about its disposal. Why? Because, as you know, radioactivity is something very dangerous to any living organism for that matter, because it causes a lot of mutations, and these mutations are going to be, at any level. It can be at any degree, and it can be in any chromosome, bringing about, ranging from small changes to big changes as such, right? So that is why it is very important for the nuclear waste to be treated first and then basically disposed. Okay, and for this disposal system, usually there is something called as deep geological disposal system of nuclear waste that is done. What is done here is that usually you take the waste, and after, of course, treatment of it and everything, you are going to bury it deep within the rocks below the earth's surface, where, slowly it will probably decay, and then, that is something where the water doesn't touch the water table, that is, the water that is used for consumption by humans, by obviously by organisms on earth. That is, this water is, kind of the water close to this area is not what is reachable, and hence it is not going to be dangerous then. And this is what is called as deep geological nuclear waste disposal. Clear, everyone? So answer is clear here. Let us look at option B, C, D also. Option B says shoot the waste into space. You don't do that, right? Because the space in itself has already so much of radioactive things and very harmful chemicals. You don't have, you can't breathe without your proper astronauts costume. You say, call it as gear, whatever is the better term to use it. It's not possible for you to actually dispose the waste in the space. Second thing is, bury the waste under Antarctic ice cover. Why would you do that? Antarctic also has some biological life. You cannot dump the waste there. Next is dump the waste within rocks under ocean. No, this is basically a misleading term where many children get confused with option A and option D. Please understand, you don't dump the waste, you treat the waste, you bury the waste at a safe height, especially under the earth's surface, right? It's close to around 500-meter deep kind of thing, half a kilometer. And dump the waste within rocks under the ocean is not going to work well. So this is also an incorrect option. Okay, so let me just kind of take through the question again. Nuclear waste is a hazardous waste obtained as a byproduct from nuclear reactors. There are fuel processing plants, there are hospitals and research centers. And like I said, it's very important for the nuclear waste to be treated first before disposal. So you bury the waste within rocks deep below the earth's surface. Clear, everyone? You pack it up nicely and then you bury it. So that is the reason why option A is going to be the right answer for this question. Let's have a look at this question. Variations caused by mutation are, or rather, as proposed by Hugo de Vries are. So, Hugo de Vries was the person who gave mutation theory. Yeah. This is an important point from the chapter evolution. You need to know this point. So, variation caused by mutations as proposed by Hugo de Vries are small and directionless, random and directional, random and directionless, or small and directional. So let me tell you the point that Hugo de Vries really believed that mutation is an absolutely jerky process. It's a very sudden process, and hence it is completely random and completely directionless, making the answer as option C, which is how it is given here. Okay, so he is basically Hugo de Vries. As you see here, he defined evolution as a jerky process, like I said, in which new varieties and species are formed by mutation, right? He said that these mutations are really continuously, completely jerky, completely happening suddenly. They are absolutely directionless, and this is what leads to formation of the new species and new varieties and the variations amongst the existing species. Clearly, the answer for this question is going to be random and directionless, which is your option C. Let's have a look at this question now. How does steroid hormone influence the cellular activities? Okay, so we are looking at steroid hormones, but actually, I would like to take you all to the functioning of both steroid as well as water soluble hormones and how exactly they function. Okay, but obviously, in the meanwhile, we'll solve the question also. For steroids, it's going to be basically at the genetic level, and that is why the right answer here is going to be option C. But let us quickly understand the concept so that we all can come together to this answer. Okay. So, here, when you talk about hormones, they are going to be obviously based on their nature and how exactly they are interacting. They are going to be either lipid soluble or they are going to be water soluble. And the best examples of lipid soluble hormones is steroids. Other than that, you also have your iodothyronins. Okay, you've heard of T3, triiodothyronin, etc. Right? So that is exactly what I'm referring to. But in this question, obviously, steroid is going to be more relevant to us. Talking about water soluble hormones, there are many protein hormones, many amino acid derived hormones. There are, polypeptides, peptides, etc. Most of them are all amino acid hormones or their derivatives. Okay, these are all going to be your water soluble hormones. What happens is that these lipid soluble hormones, they basically have their receptors within the cell, that is inside the cell and not at the plasma membrane level. Whereas when you talk about the water soluble ones, they have their receptors at the membrane. Clear? Let us first understand the functioning of the lipid soluble hormones or the intra or the steroid hormones where the receptors are present within the cell, like you see here. So let me just change the color here. Yeah, like you see here. Okay, so this is basically an intracellular receptor which is going to interact with the lipid soluble hormone. Clear, everyone? Okay, so I'm going to use the example of estrogen here, which is a female hormone, which is a very very important hormone. Female hormone, as in it's of course present in males also, but the contribution and the functioning and the physiology where it works the best and where it is more significant is of course the females. Clear, everyone? Okay, so this estrogen hormone is present in blood. Let us see, when we are looking at the uterine cell membrane, the receptor of estrogen, because it's a steroid hormone, is lying here, right? So what you see here is that this hormone is forming a complex with the receptor where it is going to lead to binding to the DNA. Okay, and this binding of the hormone and the receptor complex is going to go and bind to the gene and bringing about changes at the genetic level. And from there, the further biochemical and hence physiological changes would happen. Once again, what you see here is that this molecule, this particular structure that you're seeing here, is an estrogen molecule. It being a steroid hormone, a lipid soluble or hormone, it enters the plasma membrane. It goes through the cytoplasm and enters the nuclear membrane also, where it binds to its specific receptor molecule, specific intracellular receptor. This orangish colored thing that you're seeing is basically the hormone receptor. Okay, and the bluish colored thing here, what you're seeing, is the estrogen molecule. So what is happening here? The estrogen lipid soluble steroid hormone has bound now to the receptor molecule, and this complex is going to go and bind to DNA or the respective gene and bringing about further biochemical changes there, because of which further transcription, translation, etc. is going to change and bringing about further physiological changes. Clear, everyone? So as you have understood from this, is in a holistic way, that steroid hormone or lipid soluble hormones are going to bring about changes at the genetic level. Clear? And that is how exactly physiology is going to change from there on. Okay, now going on to the second type, which is not relevant to the question, but of course this has been covered in the incorrect options there in the question. So water soluble hormones have their receptors on the membrane, like you clearly see here. So this is a membrane receptor, and I want to explain you this by using follicle stimulating hormone or FSH as an example. So like in the previous case I showed you, so this is coming from blood, right? And as you see, in the cell membrane is lying this green colored membrane receptor, which is going to receive or interact with the water soluble hormone. Clear? With FSH right now. So this FSH has now bound to the membrane receptor, and this now triggers the changes inside the cytoplasm by usually triggering the release of secondary messengers. So for us, technically, this hormone is working like a primary source or a primary trigger. This leads to formation of or rather release of the secondary messengers, which is going to happen within the cytoplasm. Okay, and secondary messengers, best examples are calcium ions and cyclic AMP, which further brings about further cascade of events, bringing about further physiological responses. Clear, everyone? So steroid hormone or lipid soluble hormone is going to bind to the intracellular receptor, bringing about changes further by binding to the DNA or the gene, bringing about changes at the genetic level. And then talking about the second type, which is the water soluble hormones, they are going to bind to the membrane receptors, leading to usually release of the secondary messengers. Clear, everyone? So for that reason, the right answer for this question is going to be option C. Let's have a look at this question. Interesting question, straightforward question, directly from your syllabus. It's a question from genetics. In Antirrhinum majus, Antirrhinum snapdragon, a red flower was crossed with a white flower. So we have red flower crossing with the white flower, typical example of Antirrhinum. And in F1 generation, and the pink flowers were obtained. Okay. When pink flowers were selfed, the F2 generation showed white, red, and pink flowers, which are not really completely in consortia with the parental generation, or rather parents. Choose the incorrect statement from the following. So you know typically what this cross is like, especially when you talk about Antirrhinum. Where have you learned this example? You have learned this example in incomplete dominance, right? So incomplete dominance is the major keyword here. Okay, let us look at the options where they are asking about incorrect statement. First, law of segregation does not apply in this experiment. Okay, there is nothing like this. Law of segregation usually applies to almost every cross that we do. Law of segregation basically states that alleles are going to separate out during gamete formation, and they are going to randomly come together during fertilization. Okay, whether the cross is following certain Mendelian genetics or not following, this segregation is going to happen unless and until there is some mutation or things like that. But yes, alleles are going to separate during gamete formation, and they are going to come together during fertilization. Clear, everyone? So directly speaking, the first statement is an incorrect statement, and hence that gives us the right answer for this question. Talking about the further points, this experiment does not follow the principle of dominance. It's not like that. It does follow the principle of dominance, but phenotypically speaking, it shows incomplete dominance. Then pink color in F1 is due to incomplete dominance. Exactly the point, that is exactly what we have been talking about since the discussion of this question. And the ratio of F2 generation is 1/4 red, 2/4, that is half of them, 50% of them are pink in color, the flowers, and 1/4 are white in color. So this is true, right? So all the three statements here, the remaining statements are true. Let us go through the cross and try to recall everything here. So as I said, it's going to show the incomplete dominance. How exactly is it seen? Let us do the cross ourselves and understand it. So here you have taken parental generation. P represents the parental generation or the parents, where you have homozygous red variety and homozygous white variety of the snapdragon. Clear? This is going to be represented by capital R, where R are representing the alleles. Okay. Obviously allele for the flower color we are talking about here. Okay, now when the gamete formation is going to happen, the segregation is going to happen, exactly the point which was given as the incorrect statement, right? So here when separation is happening, so this is going to separate out into proper separate RR alleles, and this white one is also going to separate out into small r and small r allele, right? And irrespective of what kind of combination you try to make during the fertilization, it will lead to formation of, after the fertilization, it will lead to the formation of F1 generation, which is all going to be of R, capital R, and small r variety, which basically phenotypically speaking gave out the pink color. Now here clearly what you see is that the capital R should have been dominant on the small r, right? Capital R should have been dominant on the small r, hence giving red color according to what Mendelian genetics taught us, right? So according to Mendelian genetics, we should have received a red colored flower from this cross, where capital R is completely dominant on small r. But that is not what we are seeing. What we are seeing is a pink colored flower. That means what? That the dominant allele capital R is not showing its complete dominance over the small r or the recessive allele. Clear? I'll repeat this statement once again about incomplete dominance. The dominant allele capital R is not showing its complete dominance over the recessive allele small r. And that is why the flower color is not coming out to be red. Clear, everyone? Now, when we bring about the selfing of this capital R, small r, or the F1 generation, what happens then? You're going to separate out the allele, right? So, here is your female side, here is your male side. Obviously, the gametes are going to come from different parents, right? So capital R, small r are your alleles here, and capital R, small r are your alleles here. When you do this cross for the second generation, you're going to get 1/4 of the red flowers population. You get 1/4 of the white flower population, and you get remaining here, you can say call it as 1/4 or 1/4, and when you add it up, this will technically be 50%, or half of the total population is going to be the pink flower. So whenever you are going to get the genotype of capital R, small r, in case of incomplete dominance, in case of Snapdragon, this is going to be the pink flower. Okay. And when you see both dominant alleles, that is capital R, this is going to be red flower. Small r is going to be the white flower. So if you see the phenotypic appearance, you are going to see red and pink and white flower. If you see the genotypic ratio, you are going to see 1, that is red, 1 pink, 2 is to 1 white. Okay, this is the phenotypic part I said. Genotypically speaking, capital R is to capital R, is to capital R is to small r, and small r is to small r. Okay, so RR combination, RR combination, and this RR combination. You have to be very careful about the alphabets that you are writing down, the alphabets that you are reading it as. Okay, it's very difficult to every time say capital R, small r, capital R, small r, like that. Okay, so all in all, you have understood that Snapdragon basically shows incomplete dominance, because of which the dominant allele capital R is not going to be completely dominant over the recessive allele small r. And for that reason, in F1 generation, we see pink flowers where we should have received red flowers. And in F2 generation also, we see 50% of pink flowers to be there. But yes, there is definitely a reappearance of the parental types, that is red and white varieties as well. Okay, so the right answer for this particular question is going to be option A. Let's see this question now. Placentation, in which ovules develop on the inner wall of the ovary or in peripheral part, is called as what? Now, first thing is, what is placentation? Placentation is basically the arrangement of ovule inside the ovary. Okay, so when you see the arrangement in this way, that is in which the ovules are going to be arranged on the inner wall of the ovary or in the peripheral part. So something like this, this is what is going to be referred to as the parietal placentation. Clear, everyone? Straightforward question from the chapter Morphology of Flowering Plants. Clear? So let me help you revise all the types of placentation with at least one examples of each. So placentation is the arrangement of ovules inside the ovary. There's going to be basic, simple, marginal kind of placentation like you see in peas, axile, parietal, basal, and free central. This question is based on the parietal type of placentation. So let me take that first. So parietal placentation is when ovules develop on the inner wall of the ovary or the peripheral part, just like the question asked. Okay, here example is papaya. As you see here, this is where the ovules are attached to the inner wall of the ovary. Clear, everyone? Going ahead, free central placentation is when ovules develop on the central axis like this. Example is dianthus. Clear, everyone? Going ahead, basal placentation is when ovules develop basal, right? So it's going to be at the base of the ovary, like it's in case of the marigold flower. Clear? You see here, this is how it is attached to the base of the ovary. Going ahead, axile placentation. Axile placentation is going to be, axile. It's going to be on the axis. So ovules develop at or around the center of an ovary, around that proper axis, right? And this image is a true representative of axile kind of placentation, what you see in oranges also. Next, marginal placentation. So, as I already gave this example, it's basically the pea plant. Ovules develop on the wall along the ventral surface of the ovary, and it looks like it's growing on a single margin, right? So, that is what happens in case of peas. So, the right answer for the given question is going to be option D, parietal. Let's have a look at this question now. Select the correct group of biocontrol agents. Okay. What are biocontrol agents? Biocontrol agents are basically biological agents which are used against other organisms. Like, for example, we are using them against insects, against pests, etc. Clear, everyone? So this question, if you see, all the options given here are covered at various different places in your whole 11th and 12th syllabus with various different significance. So this question is a pretty straightforward, a fact based question where you have to look at the right combination of the biocontrol agents. And as you see, trichoderma, which is a fungus, baculovirus, which is now a virus, and bacillus thuringiensis, it's basically a bacteria. These are all used as biocontrol agents. Where and how, I'll quickly discuss with you. So this obviously becomes the right answer. So starting with the biocontrol agent first, it's basically this whole biocontrol is technically a method that is used for controlling pests and plant diseases using other organisms, which can be either bacteria, fungi, or sometimes even viruses for that matter. So antagonistic microorganisms like the species of trichoderma, which is a fungus, right? Baculovirus, which is a virus, bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacteria, and penicillium, which is a fungus, Pseudomonas, again a bacteria, these all are used. So all various different varieties and species of these organisms are what are used. Talking about trichoderma first. So it's a free living fungus which grows on the surface of the root and forms a physical barrier against the pathogenic fungi, and hence protects the root of the plant or root ecosystem and allows a better growth for the plant. Clear? Going ahead, baculovirus, these are basically double-stranded envelope virus. They produce recombinant proteins which are used as a tool for pest insect control, especially you talk about arthropods pest. Okay, so this is what baculoviruses are used against. Talking about bacillus thuringiensis, this is a very common example, very important point. It's basically a soil bacteria which makes an infected insect stop feeding within hours of ingestion and kills it, generally by rupture of digestive system. So you know what it is used for. It's basically used for creation of BT cotton, as you have learnt about it. BT cotton, BT brinjal also for that matter, but talk about cotton first. BT cotton is basically the cotton variety where we have inserted this particular gene, which is a Bacillus thuringiensis gene, which basically forms a protoxin, which, when ingested by the bollworm, which is a pest for the cotton plant, it destroys the cotton plant. So when the worm ingests it, it basically gets activated in the gut of the insect, causing the lysis and the death of the insect, and hence protecting the cotton plant. It's very interesting, right? This whole concept of using this gene and causing it to manipulate a particular plant, of course, which leads to some beneficial actions when done in control. It's very, very interesting science, right? So for this question, the right answer is going to be option C. So children, that was all about discussion of today's questions. I hope you all understood all the questions in detail that we discussed together. We'll be back with another set of questions very soon. Till then, keep learning.